This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. AASA is an organisation that does a great deal to champion animal studies. I encourage you to join today. Membership brings with it a range of benefits, including a chance to apply for AASA funding and for the AASA prizes. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. The most recently published volume in the series is the collection Decolonising Animals, edited by Rick DeVos, which addressed a topic that I know will be of great interest to lots of listeners. If you're writing about, thinking about, teaching about, or just interested in questions around decolonisation, I encourage you to get hold of a copy. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Andrew Fenton. Andrew is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Dalhousie University in Canada, where he works on, among other things, animal ethics, the philosophy of animal behaviour, and the philosophy of animal cognition. He's a co-editor of the 2020 Springer book, Neuroethics and Non-Human Animals, and a co-author of the 2019 Routledge book, Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief. Today, however, we're going to talk about his chapter, Re-Seeing Animal Research Ethics in Light of COVID-19, which was published in the 2023 Routledge collection, Contagion Narratives, The Society, Culture and Ecology of the Global South, edited by Sreejith, Varma and Ajanta Sircar. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, I was invited to a conference in August of 2020. It was held online because that was when the pandemic was really getting going and universities had shut down, and that would include in South Asia, hosted by the Vellore Technological Institute in Tamil Nadu, India. So they wanted me to speak on Buddhism, animal research ethics, and if I could, related to COVID-19, given the subject matter of the book on Contagion Narratives.
Yeah, I definitely want to ask you about animal testing and about Buddhism in a second.
Yeah.
But first of all, one of the framings that you identify around animals and COVID is the way that COVID-19 left or seems to leave other animals as our enemies. Could you introduce us to that idea?
Yeah, so this comes out of some of the media coverage because the chapter is coming out of this talk I gave at this online conference. I was attending to the way media was presenting COVID-19 and how animals are being presented in the media, and then how scientists were talking about them, and the continuing uncertainty about some of the sources for or amplifying events for COVID-19. Brought to for discussions in the media about scientists looking for potential viruses for spillover effect among free-living animals. Bat research, coronavirus research is now well entrenched in the media. We're familiar with that now as it comes up in stories, and so that was coupled with warnings that there are these viruses around the world in free-living populations of animals that potentially pose a pandemic threat to humans should, the reassortment happen. The viruses adapt to humans in a way that makes them very transmittable within our communities. And so it has this implication that worries me greatly, that, other animals who are free then have this potential threat potential. And I genuinely worry about how that might be received in general populations, particularly about bats. What will this mean for the safety of free-living bat populations? But other animals in forests where, because of clear cutting for animal-based agriculture, there are more human free-living animal encounters where diseases they are carrying spill over. Ebola is an example of a disease that will spill over into humans in places like West Africa. And it's often free-living animal-human encounters, sometimes with dead animals, sometimes with animals that are hunted. And so I have real worries about if we start thinking this way about animals, what this means about how we see them, and then how we might actually treat them.
You also talked a little bit, and this has echoes of the work of our mutual friend Jeff Sabo, about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our interactions with animals, in particular, in your case, in our interactions with animals in labs. Now, if we think about that relationship between humans and animals and how that was changed by COVID-19, we might naturally think of those headlines, which incidentally were sometimes fairly misleading, about wild animals re-entering human-controlled spaces.
Right.
But those aren't the impacts that you're talking about in this chapter, are they? So could you introduce us to the sorts of things you were talking about?
Yeah, one of the things that jumped out at me very quickly, I'll mention two things that jumped out quickly. The first thing was when universities were shutting down, including mine, toward the end of the what we call our winter semester here in the 2019-2020 academic year, labs were having to actually rethink their animal care potentials and abilities to meet certain in-house regulations or agency regulations because they would have to reduce the staff. So as they were closing down the universities, they also had to reduce the level of research they were doing. If it wasn't COVID related, that was generally regarded as non-essential, so they had to stop that. For any animals that were over the size that could be properly cared for, and I'm putting that in scare quotes because this will be audio, but properly cared for in scare quotes. If they couldn't be properly cared for with the reduced staff hours, those populations had to be depopulated, was the language that was used. And so that alarmed me because then you had, stories in Nature and Science journals where they talked about how they were killing a number of animals in large numbers to actually reduce these to the levels where they could, again, scare quotes, properly care for them. The second thing that jumped out to me, and this was using macaques in the actual SARS-CoV-2 research, was because none of the animals were presenting in just the multivarious ways that COVID-19 presents in humans. There's some of them present worse, some of them less severe. And macaques at the time were ones that presented less severely. So they would get something like a respiratory disease, but it would pass through their system within 2 weeks, but they were still being killed. And now some of this was to access their tissues and organs, and it's appalling to think that this is what was happening, that they would actually kill them just to access visceral organs to see what the virus was doing in those tissues. But they also then laid claim to and for welfare reasons, because they didn't want to actually release the macaques back into group living where they could pass on COVID to conspecifics, despite the fact that they wouldn't get really sick. They'd have this respiratory disease for a couple of weeks and then it would pass on. And then they would, do what they do as non-sick macaques in those group housings. And I just thought that was appalling to actually use language like a welfare excuse for killing these animals when really this was not welfare indicated. You could not make that argument. That I will admit that made me a little angry when I ran across that.
Now, before I ask you about research ethics, let me present an obvious worry, which I'm sure you've heard before. Is there a danger that talking about research ethics legitimizes the abuse of animals in labs? Or to put it another way, should we be challenging the use of animal models rather than exploring how we can use animals, and again, scare quotes, ethically?
Well, I think the answer to all of that is yes. I worry about this. I worry about the fact that because I'm trying to reach out in ways that are constructive, in ways that will allow for animal researchers to sit down with what I'm saying, not react in a way that would raise walls, close those doors, and chat about what can be done better for animals. What the danger here is they'll feel better about it. What I'm saying is, well, if they meet that, then surely then it's ethical. That's always a worry for me. I try to find ways to write in my papers where I'm not implying that this is the end of the conversation, that this is going to be enough. That if we're going to be holding ourselves, I think of one of my papers, our highest ethical standards, here's what they look like and what they require. Now, there's going to be resistance to that. Here's some of the stuff you could do to move towards those obligations. It's that kind of language I try to use. I'm not always great at it because, You make mistakes. I've never been wholly happy with all the papers or chapters I've published. I can always see ways I should have, wordsmithed in a way that was better, more true to this realization. So yes, I worry about it. I worry about what it will enable, the impressions it will give, where there isn't a lot of work to be done. I try to work into conversations now with animal scientists when I chat with them that I think the time has long since passed where the separation of animal research ethics codes and human research ethics code made sense. We need them aligned. There's no reason to have them separate. We should have a set of principles that we can use in human-based research and in animal-based research, and they have to be modified in ways that are sensitive to the capacities, vulnerabilities, and needs of different animals used in research, from humans and human-based research to other animals. But I think the basic ethics principles that would be ethically defensible, I think we should hold ourselves to those standards in animal-based research, much as folks should be, don't always, but much as folks should be in human-based research.
I'm glad you mentioned conversations with animal testers, because you're actually doing a lot of work directly with people who are in this space, whether they are animal testers themselves or legislators or policymakers of various kinds. And I know you can't tell us too many details, but could you give us an indication of the sorts of things you're doing there?
I am. I've had some lovely opportunities, and I'm enormously grateful for it. I'm not actually sure how some of it happened. I'm serving at the minute on a Canadian Council on Animal Care subcommittee where they're revising the core ethics document. It hasn't been revised since they created it in '91, and there wasn't a lot of ethics in it. Some kind of sensitivity to harm, but no principles at all. Anyways, I've been working with the subcommittee for several years now and revising that document. It's gone through various feedback stages. We're actually responding now to the public feedback. Hopefully the document will now be in its finishing stages towards the end of the summer, and then out for everyone to see by the end of the year, I hope, or even if in the fall. So I work with animal researchers there. I've been lucky to be invited to groups in Canada where we're working on, our wish list of changes in animal related statutes in Canada having to do with animal use and research. That's involved folks that are lawyers and veterinarians, and me as a philosopher. Kinds of conversations that come up. Things are changing. I've been very moved as someone who is an academic, and my ethics challenges are meager compared to, except the ones we all share, but meager compared to the ones that folks in animal research are faced with. And I've been very moved by openness to critically discuss animal use, critically discuss how harms and vulnerabilities get disappeared, critically discuss the problem, like the ethics problem with normalizing killing. There's most animals used in research, and people may not know this, most animals used in research are killed, but that doesn't mean that they were killed for welfare indicated reasons. If they're breeders, when they're no longer producing the litter numbers that they need, they will be killed. If their use to science is finished, but they're not presenting with deep discomfort, distress, or suffering, they'll still be killed because they're going to harvest their organs. If they're surplus in scare quotes, and they're not going to be harvesting their organs, they'll still get killed. Most are not rehomed or retired. And so this is horrifying. Like the normalization of killing, even if it's humane killing, is horrifying. And the way that euthanasia gets thrown around as a term as if this counts is deeply, deeply alarming. And I've noticed that a number of animal scientists, and I won't say in what context, but I know there are a number of animal scientists that are very concerned about the normalization of killing, for instance, and are very concerned about the vulnerabilities of their animals. It often comes up, interestingly, in ways that have to do with burnout among animal tech staff, where they bond with these animals. They really are there because they care about them, and then they're involved in overseeing them as they get very sick or distressed, and overseeing them when they're killed. And these folks will leave; they'll burn out within a year or two. And there's been real concern about how to keep them, because these are the way one university veterinarian said it to me. These are the people they want in these labs because they care about this. They were there because they cared about the animals, but they're losing them, and they don't want to lose them, and it causes them harm. I mean, the harm of animal research isn't just to other sentient beings who are non-humans, there is a harm to humans. And Tom Beecham and David deGrazia have been foregrounding that in some of their work. And the harms can be, dead ends in animal research instead of doing more human appropriate research, but also this kind of harm where these folks will carry what they did for the rest of their lives. Some of them will experience anxiety disorders from their participation in these procedures and practices. And that kind of harm needs to matter as we work in these areas.
In this particular chapter that we're talking about, one of the striking contributions that you make is to bring Buddhist ethics and Buddhist ideas to bear on questions about animal research. Now, I think it's fair to say that predominant models of research ethics, you mentioned the 3 R's, for example, before, which I'm sure lots of listeners will be familiar with, at least in the global north, are not particularly strongly associated with Buddhist thought. So why do you look to Buddhism to think about research ethics?
Well, part of this was political. And so I strongly advocate for the diversification of curricula and faculty membership within our philosophy community writ large globally. And I have deep worries about the way that the so-called West has dominated ethics discussions and frameworks in applied ethics. It doesn't really matter in what domain. This is true in a number of domains. And in animal research ethics, I think a number of ethical frameworks within a number of different philosophical lineages around the world can actually advance discussions here in a way that's very difficult, if not impossible, using so-called Western frameworks. My undergraduate, I was a double major, philosophy and religious studies. My mentor in religious studies was a South Asianist, what they call a South Asianist. That's the area he specialized in. And I have a deep love for the philosophical religious traditions of South Asia. I'm, much more comfortable talking about the philosophical frameworks coming out of a set of those traditions. And Buddhism was it's one that means a lot to me personally. I don't think I could identify as Buddhist, but it means a lot to me. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that family of philosophical religious traditions, because it's very diverse as a religious family, and much to contribute to applied ethics.
So bearing that diversity in mind, could you introduce us to the particular Buddhist approach to animal research ethics that you take or you explore in this particular paper?
Yeah, so I use a number of their core commitments that I would see as common across the Buddhist world, because again, it's very diverse, and there's going to be no one way to do this. There's a few people writing on this, not many surprisingly, but a few people writing on this, applying Buddhist ethical frameworks to the use of animals, including in science. And I don't think there's any, right way to do this. I think it's going to be a number of ways to do this. And so I'm just seeing myself as inserting into a conversation that I hope will continue to grow, and lots of folks will bring in their take on how to do this. A number of commitments that are shared. So lots of Buddhists, if not all Buddhists, are committed to the elimination and overcoming of dukkha. It's a Sanskrit term, very, very difficult to translate into English, not unlike other key terms in classical languages around the world. It basically means in Sanskrit bad state. And that's the way it's often used in Buddhist philosophies. It's anything that's associated with something intrinsically bad for us and other sentient beings. So it can include pain, the awareness of even pleasure states will end, and that kind of dread of states ending, our cravings and how our cravings actually don't help us live well. So dukkha is one of them. Another is karuna, and that's often translated care, sometimes compassion, and that's a motivator. Karuna is about more than just feeling an empathetic response to those around us who are sentient and suffering, but responding to it in ways to try and alleviate it or eliminate it. And then ahimsa is another commitment that often gets translated as nonviolence. It can be understood as non-harming. Ahimsa is broadly interpreted as harm, and it can be within the Jain traditions. It can be mental harm as well as physical harm. So it can be thoughts and intentions as well as actions. And then the final orientation, or the final commitment I have, is praticit samuppada. Often gets translated dependent origination or interdependent arising. Simply has to do with the fact that none of us writ large, to include all sorts of individuals in the world, sentient and non-sentient, or islands isolated from others. We're all entangled causally And that causal entanglement means that when we're thinking about eliminating dukkha or overcoming dukkha, it's not just and can't be just about us, because we're all entangled. And so if our commitment is to eliminate or overcome dukkha, it's actually dukkha wherever it's found, because there's no strong self, non-self boundary. I mean, anyone that knows their Buddhist philosophies will know that there's an interrogation, a critical interrogation of self-talk, because self-talk can be translated into some kind of quasi-eternal being that underlies our changing selves, and that's rejected in Buddhism across the Buddhist world. And then they have various ways to try and figure out, well, how do you talk about personal identity then if you're going to do that? And there's all sorts of interesting philosophical stuff there. But it does mean, because of the no strong self, no self boundary, others come in to our discussion of ethics in a way that cannot not come in. And because of their inclusive gaze, and they're not unique in this in South Asia, this includes other sentient beings and individuals, beings that will be used in research. And so it's just so ready to be used in ways that will do good work in animal research ethics, and in ways that will push envelopes against the dominant consequentialist framing and so-called Western animal research ethics and the problems of that, because I think it's deeply problematic to rest our ethical discussions in a framework that is solely consequentialist. It's gonna fail to attend to things that matter ethically if we do that.
I think a lot of people, whether they know Buddhist philosophy well or not, might imagine that a Buddhist research ethics would simply say, given the concern with suffering, given this rejection of the human-animal binary, given this commitment to no harm, well, we can't use animals in research, or at the very least, we can't use them when such use would be harmful. But you reject this framing. Could you tell us why?
Yeah, so you're right, and there are folks that have done that, and in the division of labor within this conversation, that's a welcome voice, and I'm glad it's out there, and folks should take it very seriously, sit down with the arguments, and think through the pitch they give for thinking of Buddhism as fundamentally abolitionist here when it comes to animals and used in science. And I'll just use the phrase used in science here just to flag that it can include teaching, testing, and research, so that it's broad. Because that's generally, although we talk about animal research ethics, tends to be understood in terms of including all of those. And I know there's some educators out there that are very frustrated when we don't acknowledge that animals are used in educational contexts. And there's lots of ethics issues that come out of that I touch on in this paper and touch on elsewhere, and shouldn't be forgotten. The thing that dragged me into this to start talking about this in papers I write was, well, if you think of human-based research, Buddhism doesn't have to be against human-based research, and the same thing happens there. Research is research. If we knew what the outcomes were going to be, it wouldn't be experimental. And so there are risks associated with human-based research that humans also face, and there will be harms that they face. Does that mean that you can't have Buddhists that are human-based scientists, or scientists that do human-based research? I think the answer is no. Damien Keown has also written on this when it comes to medicine, and asked questions about, is it against Buddhist teaching to seek medical help, given that karma, within a traditional Buddhist framing, karma can actually be used to explain a whole bunch of our ills. Are we going against Buddhism to do that? And he says, no, we've got to allow for that. And so that allows for a bit of wedge here where we can say, well, one, karma is not going to be hegemonic here in shutting this conversation down when we're actually pursuing things like medicine and advancements in medicine. We could imagine that you could have an ethical Buddhist scientist that does human-based research. So could we imagine an ethical Buddhist, or a Buddhist committed to infusing their animal research ethics with Buddhist commitments, and then start or continue to do animal-based research? And I think the answer there, I think it has to be yes, because I think I have companion animals. I've now two. We sadly lost one of our girls last summer, 18-year-old domestic cat. But we have two domestic cats now, and my experience with our veterinarians, and I'm thankful for having such great healthcare providers for our two cats. It's pretty clear that veterinary medicine is not anywhere near as advanced as it is in human-based medicine, and that has to change. Our companion animals and other animals in and outside of human societies are also have a right to health, and if anyone has a right to health, and that has to include a discussion about health care. But we need to have good science-based health care if we're going to avoid unnecessary harm and distress and death. And so I think in the name of advancing veterinary medicine, we need to do that. We also need to remember that when we're developing vaccine interventions or other interventions for humans, these are often tested in animals and can mean that they could be actually more useful for the non-humans than humans, because lots of animal trials fail when they switch to humans, because we are different from given our evolutionary journeys. We forget that they will fail, but then that often becomes a story point. And you go, well, wait a second. Every time those moved to first in human trials, it was because they were succeeding with the animals that they were using. But that means that, forget the failure with the humans, it means that they might actually be useful for their healthcare. And I think, even when they're being used for human targeted populations or the environment at large, because sometimes that's the way it goes to testing, we can still see that this can actually have a benefit to those animals used. Now, with the caveat that things have to massively change. So, I do two things in this chapter. One is you don't get to endanger these animals unless it offers direct benefit to them. And this has been a restriction in human-based research, is you don't get to do something that comes with risk if it doesn't offer direct benefit, and direct benefit they couldn't get elsewhere. This is like the standard lines in human research codes, and I think that belongs in animal research codes too. And that means that if they're being used for the benefit of a population that's not them directly, or even for us, that means they don't get to be used in ways that are beyond minimal risk. This is a language used in human research where minimal risk is what folks would ordinarily be exposed to. The way I translate that in animal research ethics is what animals would be ordinarily exposed to if they were in supportive environments, not ones where we actually present anthropogenic dangers and risks to them. And those are fairly strong constraints on. And so, although I'm trying to create a space where animal research can continue, it can't continue the way it is now. It would have to massively change for it to be ethical, I think.
Let me offer a challenge that might have occurred to some listeners.
Yeah.
What's to stop someone saying, well, this is all very interesting, but I'm not a Buddhist, so I've no particular reason to accept these arguments?
As a good pushback. So my response here would be, I'm not an Aristotelian either, and I'm not a Kantian, and I'm not a Platonist. But it doesn't mean that they don't provide wisdom and insight. It doesn't matter where this wisdom is. I don't think anyone has a corner on this, and I don't think anyone has a corner on philosophical insight or ethical insight. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't avail ourselves of insights wherever they're found. And Buddhism has them, and it has them by the truckload. And it's not to say that in Buddhist worlds, there aren't issues to be worked out, both with animals and with humans. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm not saying that it's done perfectly. I'm not saying that, Buddhism is the be all and end all, and that all we have to do now is Buddhist applied ethics and forget everything else. I'm not saying that either. There's a lot of wisdom that you see in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition. I mentioned Kant and Aristotle and Plato. And more. In the contemporary sphere, lots. We've never been in a period where there's been so many philosophers. They tend to talk about the golden age of philosophy in the classical period. This is the golden age of philosophy. We've never had so many philosophers as now. It's great to have so many. It's lovely, and have conversations and arguments and support each other, even through our arguments, which may sound weird to folks who aren't philosophers. So I think we should sit down with these traditions. I'm not asking anyone to convert to Buddhism. I'm not even asking anyone to take the cosmology seriously. I don't believe in a cosmological karma. I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't believe in superhuman powers like telepathy, telekinesis, or omniscience, and all of those are associated with folks like the historical Buddha. But when you have the insights like the moral importance of dukkha, the moral importance of, because this is the most ambitious commitment I've ever seen in global philosophy, of ahimsa, where we truly, genuinely try to live non-violently or non-harmfully. The most ambitious commitment I have ever heard of in the so-called West or in the various Asian philosophical traditions. And if we think of care, so care ethics is rightfully a part of our discussions now in applied ethics, and feminist care ethics has been a part of that journey and in deeply important ways and continues to be. And Karuna as care is really important. It's a reminder that that insight about the importance of compassion and care is an old one. It's not a new one. And in some ways, for myself, speaking poetically, I see these kinds of conversations of returning home to a set of lovely, like religiously and philosophically important traditions in the classical period. But I'm not asking anyone to convert to Buddhism. I don't hold a number of Buddhist cosmological commitments myself, but I think we do ourselves a disfavor if we don't avail ourselves of the relevant tools that are around in global philosophy.
Now, Andrew, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Go for it.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So my memory's bad. So honestly, no. But let me give you an answer to it, because that's an unsatisfactory answer or unsatisfying answer. So broadly interpreting pro-animal scholarship and picking out something, and it had a huge impact on me in my PhD studies. And this will sound crazy. I was just in the University of Calgary bookstore walking around bad books. There's a collection of essays on primatology. The title of the volume was Chimpanzee Cultures. There's a bunch of chapters on various primatologists talking about cultural aspects of chimpanzee lives across chimpanzee societies in sub-Saharan Africa. Harvard University Press, 1996, and that changed me. I can remember reading some of the data to my partner at the time, and it changed us both. It's just learning about chimpanzee cultures and their tool use and their normative behaviors, and the way that some will actually, interject into fights to calm others down. And it just changed me. I just like to think of other animals in the Stone Age, like Western chimpanzees and their use of percussion technology. It just changed me. I had a huge impact on where I've gone since.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So let me do a broad interpretation of that. And so way back in 1997, I was taking the reason why I picked up this book is I was taking a PhD course. It's a grad course on agency theory and philosophy. We're reading a lot of Donald Davidson, and he has a lot of things to say about animals in ways that are negative. And I just didn't buy it. So I picked up this book and was looking through it. And okay, I'm going to do a paper where I take on Donald Davidson using some of his central commitments and just showing, even given his central commitments, chimpanzees, we can talk about them in all seriousness as minded animals and beings and agents. And that was my first entry into this, and it generated a couple of conference presentations. It's not something I published, but it gave me a chance to present at a couple of conferences and get kicked around a bit in Q&A and advocate for animal rights.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It's a great question. So I again, broadly interpreting animal studies scholar, would have to be Frans de Waal. His Chimpanzee Politics book, if anyone hasn't read that yet, please read it. It's an oldie and a goodie, and there's some stuff in it that's regrettable, but that's what makes it philosophically interesting to me, and lots of stuff to think about, because I have no doubt about the veracity of what he's describing. And if you don't know a lot about chimpanzees and haven't thought about their agency, that's a good place to start. So Frans de Waal, I don't agree with him on everything. I'm a philosopher. I don't agree with myself on everything, depending on what I've written. He's now retired, and he's just a great thinker, very, very smart primatologist. If he ever hears this, had a huge impact on me and my journey.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
That's another good question. I think the what I'll say is resist anthropocentrism and human supremacism in our scholarship, teaching, and advocacy. I think those framings are doing a lot of harm. And as our planet moves into its burning mode, sometimes literally, we really do need to rethink the anthropocentrism and human supremacy. Philosophy is terrible for this. And so we have a chance here to reset. And I think we should in our scholarship, teaching, and advocacy.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I have to admit, I don't think any one thing's going to make a huge difference here. Now, if you're going to push me on this, because again, I don't think that's a satisfying answer. So if you're going to push me on it, what I'd say is imagine if humans no longer acted violently towards animals, except in the cases where we could ethically violently act against anyone, regardless of species. And imagine if we did that. I think that, that would be a very different world.
What are you working on next?
So I'm on sabbatical next year. Yay, my first one. So I'm going to be returning. My dissertation was on chimpanzee knowledge understood through the lens of primatology and what it should mean for analytic epistemology. That is the theory of knowledge and rational belief and justified belief and things like evidence, what evidence will look like, what epistemic agency is. So what are we as epistemic agents as we go about the world? So I'll be going back to that again for animals and again interrogating where we should be going as epistemologists as we talk about that. And then the Canadian Council Animal Care Committee's revised document should be out hopefully by the end of this year, if not the fall. I've got a couple of conference presentations in the end of the summer where I'll talk about the changes in the document from what I know at the time and can talk about, and where I would hope they would go in the future when they return to this document and revise it next time. I have some things that I'd like to see in the next iteration of these revisions when that time is right.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I got a personal website now. Just Google andrewfenton.ca and that should come up. And I keep that reasonably up to date.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. It's been a real pleasure, and I just loved the opportunity to hang out with you again. So thanks for that too.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and you can also follow me on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. Please do tell others about the show, and if you're teaching this year, why not include some of the episodes on your reading list for students to tune into? I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.